Welcome to Introduction to Fly Tying. My name is Greg Vinci, and I'll be your instructor who will take you on a journey that will provide you skills and knowledge that will greatly enhance your fly fishing experience. Though this video will provide you with all of the basic skills, there's not enough time in this video to go over the fine points of tying flies. I strongly recommend that you get some personal instruction whenever possible. Instruction can be found at fly fishing shows, fly club meetings, and at your local fly shop. Now we're going to learn the parts of the fly. They are the tail, the abdomen, the thorax, and the legs. The tools that we'll be using are the bobbin threader, hackle plier, half-hitch tool, scissors, and hair stacker. The thread spool is attached by snapping it in between the arms of the bobbin. We then take the bobbin threader and insert it into the tip of the bobbin so that it protrudes from the base. Then we take the end of the thread and insert it into the protruding wire loop of the bobbin threader. Finally, pull the loop up through the tube and out of the tip. In order to even the hairs of the clump of elk hair we use for hair wing flies, such as the elk hair caddis we will tie later in the video, we use a device called the hair stacker. We begin by cutting a clump of elk hair or deer hair that we are using to tie our hair wing fly. It is important to brush the hair to remove the underfur so that the hair packs evenly in the hair stacker. Now place the tips of the hair into the flared top of the hair stacker and push down. To remove the packed hair, we slowly rocked the flared tube of the hair stacker while gradually removing it from its base. It helps if you hold the hair stacker with the base slightly elevated. The hackle plier are used to facilitate handling of delicate materials such as hackle when being wound onto the fly. Squeeze the pliers between your thumb and forefinger and clip the jaws onto the tip of the hackle, and then gently wrap the hackle around the shank of the hook. Be careful not to put pressure on the hackle as it will easily break. We will begin by tying a woolly bugger. The woolly bugger is fished underwater, and depending on how it's presented and the color it's tied in, represents a large array of aquatic life forms, such as small fish, crawdads, and leeches, to name a few. Materials that we will use to tie a woolly bugger are marabou, chenille, hook, hackle, copper wire, half-hitch tool, scissors, and bobbin threader. The first step in tying the fly is to pinch the barb. Barbless flies are easier to remove from the fish, meaning that the fish spends less time out of the water, resulting in less stress. Now place the hook in the vise and level it and clamp the jaws. To begin wrapping the thread, make several wraps just behind the eye of the hook. wrapping the thread over itself several times to secure it to the hook shank. Now wrap towards the bend of the hook, making sure your wraps are as close together as possible. Creating a thread base on the hook shank in the beginning will make the fastening of materials much easier as we proceed. Once you get to the bend of the hook, stop. We now wrap either lead wire or non-toxic wire around the bend of the hook to about 1/4 inch behind the eye to give the fly some extra weight. Then we wrap back over the wound wire with the thread to help secure it, and finish off by applying some head cement to the wraps. Now we're going to tie in the tail. We take a clump of marabou and we place it over the bend of the hook and take a loose wrap of thread and then gradually wrap tighter and tighter to secure the marabou. And now we can clip away the extra marabou so we have more room to work. Then keep wrapping forward and backwards. Keep it secure. Now we take a couple strands of crystal flash and we tie those in right at the base of the tail. The next step is to tie in a piece of chenille. And follow the chenille with a section of copper wire that we're going to use for the ribbing. Here we'll tie in the hackle. Take the hackle, hold it by the tip, between the thumb and the forefinger, pull it down, strip it, in other words, so that the barbs flare. Then take the tip and wrap it to the shank of the hook. And then trim off the excess. Now wrap the thread forward, stopping about 1/8 of an inch behind the eye. It's important that you leave room behind the eye so it doesn't get crowded by materials when you've completed the fly. At this point, wrap the chenille forward and tie it off with several wraps of thread. Next, wrap the hackle forward, letting the space between the wraps of chenille determine the spacing of the hackle wraps.
And finally, we'll take the copper wire and counter wrap it forwards towards the eye of the hook. We gently work the wire between the barbs of the hackle. We don't want to mat down the barbs as we wrap forward. And we trim off the excess of the wire and finish off by wrapping thread behind the eye, making 3 half hitches, and we have a completed fly. The rockworm represents the larval stage of the caddisfly. Caddisfly larvae crawl around the stream bottom and when mature enough morph into the pupa stage and ascend to the surface where they escape their exoskeleton and fly away. These are relatively big bugs and the trout love them.
The materials that you'll need to tie the rockworm are olive dubbing, fine copper wire, about size 14 or 16 straight shanked hook, peacock herl, olive thread, and of course a bobbin, scissors, and half hitch tool.
As with the woolly bugger, we begin by wrapping the thread from the eye of the hook back towards the bend of the hook. Here we're going to tie in the copper wire. Instead of placing the wire parallel to the hook before fastening with thread, try laying it over the hook shank at the bend at a 45-degree angle and then wrapping the thread. Make several tight wraps to secure the wire. We're now going to create the body or abdomen of the fly by using a technique called applying dubbing. Take a sparse portion of the dubbing between your thumb and forefinger and begin twisting on the thread. Moistening your fingers with spit or a little wax will make this process easier. The dubbing should be tightly spun around the thread. Now take the spun thread and begin wrapping forward in close wraps towards the eye of the hook, stopping at about 1/4 of an inch behind the eye. You are going to want to wrap back and forth so that a taper is created and so that the abdomen gets gradually thicker towards the eye of the hook. Now wrap the copper wire forward in widely spaced even wraps to create the illusion of body segments. And stop when you reach the thread. Make a couple of wraps of thread to secure the wire and then trim the loose end. Tie in several strands of peacock herl and wrap the thread to a point that's about a 1/16 of an inch behind the eye. Now wrap the herl to the thread and secure with a couple of thread wraps. Finally finish by applying 3 half hitches with the half hitch tool. Trim off any errant hairs and apply a small amount of head cement to the wraps. You've now tied a rockworm. The pheasant-tail nymph is one of the most useful nymph patterns there is. This simple pattern represents a whole array of mayfly larvae, and depending on the size, can mimic everything from the tiny blue-wing olives to the giant green drakes. The materials and tools we will use to tie the pheasant tail are the pheasant tail feather, copper wire, hook, peacock herl, scissors, half-hitch tool, and the bobbin and thread. The first step in tying the pheasant tail, as with all the other flies on this DVD, is to begin by wrapping the thread from behind the eye of the hook back towards the bend. You're going to stop at a position roughly right above where the barb of the hook is located. At this point, we're going to cut about a 1/16 of an inch clump of pheasant tail barbules, which consists of maybe about 6 or 7 strands, and we're going to tie them in at the tail, with of course the pointed ends pointing to the rear. The length of the tail is going to be about 1/3 of the distance from the eye of the hook back to the bend. We take a couple wraps to secure the tail to the shank. Now we're going to tie in a section of copper wire. Copper wire is going to be used as the ribbing and to add a little flash to the fly. Keep in mind we're tying the materials so that they point to the rear of the hook, not towards the front of the hook. Okay, we're wrapping forward, and we're going to wrap back to the eye. Now we'll take the butt ends of the section of pheasant tail that we used for the tail and use them to wrap forward towards the eye. And we're going to stop about 1/3 of the way back from the eye. We'll take a couple wraps of thread to secure the pheasant tail to the shank, and we'll trim off the loose ends. Now we'll take the copper wire and we'll wrap it forward over the pheasant tail wraps. But we're going to take wide wraps of wire, maybe only 3 or 4, so that they overlap the wraps and secure the pheasant tail to the shank of the hook. Cut about a 1/4 inch clump of pheasant tail and place it about 1/3 of the way back from the eye of the hook, with the tips facing to the rear. I like to use the dark hued portion of the pheasant tail as it will give the wing case the look of a nymph getting ready to hatch. Secure the pheasant tail with several tight wraps of thread. Next, tie in a couple strands of peacock herl just in front of where you tied in the pheasant tail for the wing case. Now wrap the peacock herl forward to about 1/16 of an inch behind the eye, and then secure with thread. At this point, we'll tie in the legs. Cut about 3 or 4 pheasant tail barbules and tie in so that they splay to the side of the hook shank or fly. The length of the legs should be about equal to the shank of the fly. Do the same thing again to attach the legs to the opposite side. Finally, pull the wing case over the wrapped pheasant tail herl and secure with several wraps of thread. Make several tight wraps forward to the eye of the hook and finish off with 3 half hitches. At the very end, add a couple drops of head cement to the wraps, and we're finished. The Adams has been around a long time because it is one of the most effective dry flies ever developed. It owes much of its success to the fact that its neutral coloration is never the wrong color to the fish, and its two-tone hackle and tail are always visible no matter what the lighting conditions are. The Adams is a great mayfly pattern, but will work well during hatches of other aquatic insects too. We begin the Adams by wrapping our thread in tight wraps from the eye back to the bend of the hook, just like we have with the previous flies that we've learned about in this video. Now we're going to tie in the tail. We'll start by trimming off the longer barbs on a piece of grizzly hackle. And remember that the length of the barbs should be roughly 1/3 of the length of the hook shank between the eye and the bend. Now we'll cut off a small section of barbs from a piece of brown hackle. and we also tie it in at the bend. These combination of colors make the fly very easy for the fish to see. Now we'll begin applying the dubbing. Take a small clump and then pull out a few strands and start twisting it around the thread. We want to create what appears to be like a small diameter yarn, which we're going to eventually wrap around the shank of the hook. The best rule of thumb is to use less rather than more. Sometimes a little bit of spit will help you wrap the yarn a little more effectively. Now we wrap forward in tight wraps towards the eye. We're going to try to create a taper of dubbing so that the abdomen of the fly looks almost cone-shaped when we're done. Don't get discouraged if you find the dubbing technique difficult to master. Just keep practicing and practicing, and eventually you'll get it right. As we dub, we want to create a taper with the dubbing. We'll now tie in our hackle. Take a feather of the grizzly hackle and strip away the barbs at the stem. Now it's important to remember that the curved or shiny side of the hackle should be tied in so that it faces the eye of the hook. We tied in with about 3 or 4 wraps, trim off the stem, and now we're going to do the same with the brown hackle feather. It's important to remember that the thread wraps need to be very tight. Now we begin wrapping the hackle around the shank of the hook. With long saddle hackle, you can do as I'm doing and just use your fingers to hold the hackle. With shorter sections of hackle, we want to use the hackle pliers that we learned about earlier in this DVD. Now we'll wrap the brown hackle through the wraps of grizzly hackle forwards towards the eye. We take 2 or 3 wraps of thread to secure it, then trim it off very close to the shank of the hook. Trim off the little excess barbules that are sticking out. Take a few more wraps. And finish off with some half hitches. Here I'm demonstrating how to make half hitches without the use of a half hitch tool. Application of some head cement behind the eye and in between the wraps finishes off the fly. One of the best patterns that represents the adult stage of the caddisfly is the elk-haired caddis. The elk-haired caddis is one of the most impressionistic flies in that it doesn't exactly look like the real bug, but to the fish looking up at the fly sitting on the surface film, its dangling legs and elk-hair wing gives the impression of a caddisfly sitting on the water that might get away if the fish doesn't act quickly. The materials and tools we'll use to tie the elk-hair caddis are dubbing, brown hackle, hook, elk hair, bobbin and thread, scissors, half-hitch tool, and hair stacker. Like the other patterns, we begin by wrapping the thread back towards the bend of the hook. The first step is to take the hackle feather and remove the softer barbules attached to the butt end of the stem. We'll now tie it in to the bend of the hook. Now dub the thread and begin wrapping forward to about 1/8 of an inch behind the eye of the hook. Be particularly careful to allow for plenty of space so that the eye does not get crowded when we're finished. Crowded eyes make threading the hook with your tippet very, very difficult. Once the abdomen has been dubbed, make several wide wraps of hackle, making sure that the wraps are evenly spaced. Now make several tight wraps of thread to make sure that the hackle is secure. Now we're ready for the wing. Cut a clump of deer hair or elk hair, brush it clean just as we did in the hair stacker demo earlier in the DVD, and place it into the hair stacker. Remove the stacked hair and carefully place it on the shank of the hook. The length of the wing should be the same as the distance between the eye of the hook and the bend. Make a couple of loose wraps over the elk hair clump and then wrap gradually tighter and tighter until secure. Make a couple of tight wraps just behind the eye, then tie in 3 half hitches. Trim the butt ends of the wing and apply head cement to the wing wraps and to the half hitches behind the eye. The parachute is one of the most realistic of the dry flies. When viewed by the fish from below the surface, its silhouette very much resembles that of a newly emerged adult mayfly sitting in the surface film waiting for its wings to dry so that it can fly away and mate. Tied in different colors and sizes, it can mimic any mayfly species from giant-sized hexagenias down to tiny blue-wing olives.
The materials and tools for tying a parachute are as follows. Dubbing, polypro yarn that can be used for tying the post, or you can use calf tail if that's what came with your kit, hook, grizzly hackle, bobbin with thread, scissors, half-hitch tool, and hackle pliers.
After wrapping the thread to the bend of the hook, we will tie in the tail. We are going to tie this parachute atom style, so we'll use a combination of grizzly and brown hackle barbs for the tail. Now wrap the thread forward away from the bend, stopping 1/3 of the way back from the eye. Here is where we'll tie in the post. To the fish looking at the fly from below, the post gives the impression of the mayfly's wing. Several different materials can be used for the post, such as calf tail or polypropylene, but in this video we're using polypropylene. Cut off a short length and make several tight wraps to secure it, and then pull the post into a vertical position and make several wraps in front of the post, building up the thread so that the post stands on its own. Now make several horizontal wraps around the post so as to create some rigidity. Wrap the thread back to the bend of the hook, and we will begin dubbing the abdomen just as we did for the atoms earlier in this video. Rather than create an exaggerated tapered body as we did on the atoms, here we'll just create a gradual taper. Don't forget to apply the dubbing sparsely to the thread. We'll now tie in our hackle. Take a feather of the grizzly hackle and strip away the barbs at the stem. Now it's important to remember that the curved or shiny side of the hackle should be tied so that it faces up. After tying in the hackle, wrap the hackle slowly around the base of the parachute post, trying to keep it as tight as possible. Sometimes you may have to hold the post so it doesn't bend while you wrap the hackle. Once finished, then you can take a couple wraps of thread, being careful not to pinch the barbs behind the eye of the hook to secure the hackle. Pull back the hackle and make several wraps of thread between the post and the eye. And then trim off any hackle barbils that get in the way of the eye of the hook. Now use the half hitch tool to finish it off. Finally, apply a drop of head cement to the wraps behind the eye and to the base of the parachute post so as to glue in the hackle wraps. Trim the parachute post to the desired length, which is usually equal to the distance between the eye of the hook and the bend. You have now completed tying the most difficult of flies, the parachute.
There you have it. You now have all the skills necessary to embark on a lifetime of tying flies. When you're on the stream, remember to pinch your barbs, release your fish, and keep our waterways clean.